what I can do today is sort of take you by the hand and lead you past the evidence that has led me to 4 major conclusions after 49 years of study and investigation. First, the evidence showing that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some UFOs, underline the some 37 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft, most are not. Just like most isotopes aren't fissionable. You want to build a bomb or a reactor, some are, fortunately, and they're the ones you focus on. Second, we're dealing with a kind of cosmic Watergate. Everybody in the government knows what's going on. That's not how you keep secrets. It means that some few people have, at least 1947, when we recovered 2 crashed flying saucers and several alien bodies in New Mexico, that indeed some UFOs are alien. Third, none of the objections raised to the conclusions by a small group of noisy negativists, as I call them, people like my University of Chicago classmate for 3 years, Carl Sagan. He never bragged about me being his classmate, so I can brag the other way around, because he'll hear, and he unfortunately is not. None of the objections raised by people like Carl stand up under careful scrutiny. They sound great until you look at them, they collapse of their own weight, which isn't much. And finally, 4, because I'm obviously such a shy, retiring kind of, with the biggest story of the millennium. Visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft, successful cover-up of the best data, for years as of this year. And I will be in Roswell to celebrate Roswell in early July, 60 years ago. Okay, now, said all that, the noisy negativist would say, we know there's nothing to flying saucers. Better let you understand something. Why do I say it's an old term? Why don't you say UFOs? Because saucers are UFOs. UFOs are flying saucers. All great-grandfathers are men. Not all men are great-grandfathers. So my focus is on the flying saucers. Now, all UFO sightings can be put in one of 3 categories, boxes, if you will. UFOs convert IFOs, identifiable flying objects. This is by far the largest group. Most things that people see that they can't identify can indeed be identified by a competent investigator spending enough time on it. Having said that, forget them. If you're mining gold, forget the dross. It's the gold you're after. Keep your eye on the gold. The second category includes only those reports for which there is insufficient information on which to base a scientific conclusion as to what was observed. If you don't have enough data, there's nothing much useful you can do with those. Category 2, forget that one as well. That leaves us only with the sighting. 3 is a database for scientific investigation. These are reports by competent observers of strange phenomena in the sky or on the ground which remain unidentified after investigation, competent investigators, and which we furthermore judge to be manufactured based on the way they look, not just the light in the sky, and which we deduce were made elsewhere than on Earth based on the way they behave. That's a lot of kickers on that definition. And that's where the skeptic would say, hey, just cast up his lecture, because we all know there aren't any good sightings by competent observers that can't be competent investigators. Right? Wrong. Totally incorrect. Definitely untrue. Absolute nonsense. You get the picture. The major point I want to make today is that every large-scale scientific flying saucers, and I'll talk about 5 of them, have produced a substantial number of Category 3 reports. Competent observer, competent investigator, and every indication we're dealing with somebody else's spacecraft. The problem isn't that there isn't enough data to justify my conclusions. The problem is that most people are unaware of that data. So the first part of my lecture, strange as it may seem, but what you do, I'm a physicist after all, is to deal with the data. There's more besides the large-scale scientific studies, and we'll get into that too. Now, the largest comprehensive scientific study of flying saucers ever done, here's a cover, privately a version, Blue Book Special Reporting. My slide is too thick to fit in the frame. This study was done, completed in 1955 at the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, a very well-respected research and development firm. They're under contract to the old Air Force Project Blue Book at Wright Space just outside Dayton, Ohio. And it was Battelle's job, all the sightings in the Air Force files up through that time, every single report, 200 of them, was eventually categorized as something or other, aircraft, balloon, astronomical. They did a quality evaluation of reports. They compiled a huge amount of data. There are 240 tables, graphs, and maps in this report. Now, the report itself was not publicly distributed. Instead, very wide distribution was given to a very misleading press report, if you will. October 1955. Made it in the papers everywhere. 23rd, I think it was. It's in the volume. But they said in the press report, well, I'll quote what the secretary, let's turn the projector on and turn the light off. There's a switch right over.
Melody, there's a switch over there. The other one.
Okay? This is what the, and focus on that top there maybe a little bit. This is from the Secretary of the Air Force. On this study, we believe that no objects such as those flying saucers have overflown the United States. I feel certain that the unknown 3% could have been explained as conventional phenomena illusions if more complete observational data had been obtained. There's two factual statements there. The number of unknowns percentage of unknowns was only 3%, and that's just because there wasn't enough data. Category 2 reports, there are no Category 3 reports, and we can forget all this flying saucers. Very wide distribution was given to that press release. They also sent out a summary, but the summary doesn't include any of the data from the report itself. I don't know how you do a summary without, when you have such a huge mass of data, without including any, but they did, and they with it. Furthermore, they didn't say who did the work, and they didn't give the title of the report, Blue Book Special Report number 14. Surely had somebody in the press would have said, hey, wait a minute, what do you mean 14? Where's 1 through 13? Well, they're all classified, would have to have been the answer. They weren't going to say that. Now, the only trouble with those two factual statements is that they are both totally false. Government UFO lies. Let's look at the next slide to see if we get the idea. This is the Categorizing 3,201 sightings. Blue Book Special Report number 4. The definitions are pretty clear here. Miscellaneous covers a lot of ground. This is really psychological aberrations, a polite way of saying crackpot cases. I must admit to you, as a physicist and member of the American Physical Society, that the physical, he says, 2 papers submitted to it by physicists are crackpot papers. That means there's more crackpots associated with flying saucers than with physics. I'm one of the few with a foot in each camp, you understand. Okay, the ones we're interested in are the last category here, the unknowns. 3%? Forget it was 21.5%. That's not just a slight mathematical error. Major lie. Not only were the unknowns not 3%, but there's a category here, insufficient information, out of their way to stretch a report. If there wasn't enough data available about a sighting, it could not be listed as an unknown. It had to be listed, appropriately enough, as insufficient information. So the Secretary of the Air Force was playing fast and loose with the facts and got away with it. New York Times didn't catch him. Washington Post didn't catch him. See, when I found this out several years after this. Now, I mentioned that they did a quality evaluation of all the reports. Well, Carl Sagan has said publicly and in print that there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable. There are reliable sightings that aren't interesting, but there are no interesting and reliable reports. Sounds good? Let's look at the next slide. More baloney. A lot of good delicatessen in New York, so. This is the quality evaluation of the same 3,201 sightings. Best sightings at the top, worst at the bottom. Only, that's an Air Force word. Whenever they talk about unknowns, it's always only. You know, if you were looking for a cure for cancer and you tried 600 drugs, if one worked, you wouldn't say, well, only one works, I guess there's no cure. You say, give me the one. But of the best cases, and only 10% qualified, 35% were unknowns. Of the 14% were unknown. The better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be an unknown. Exactly the opposite of what Carl and many others. Equally intriguing, of course, the better the quality, moving up this way, generally speaking, the less likely to be listed as insufficient. Now, this is not strictly what you'd expect to be really something different, which was the whole point of doing this categorization. But if they're aircraft, balloons, astronomical, miscellaneous, crackpot, etc., what out of this world were they? How do I get out of this world from jumpers? two things taken together, the appearance of the unknown coupled with the behavior of the unknown. Typically, we're dealing with apparently round, seemingly metallic, disc-shaped objects, definite size, shape, surface texture, protuberances that might be land, might be domes, might be hood ornaments, you don't know. Size, say, 10 to 35 feet in general, there's a distribution. A few, much smaller number of reports of huge cigar-shaped so-called motherships into and out of which the little ones fly. Now, when I say huge, there's a good case up in the Yukon where a civil engineer was able to interview 30-some witnesses, groups of 2 and 3. This darn thing he was able to triangulate was between 0.6 and 1.2 miles long. The Japan Airlines 747 pilot said the thing that stuck with them for over Alaska was twice the size of an aircraft carrier. Talked to a pilot flying over Ontario. It was 5 or 6 times the size of a 747 and flew at 50 miles an hour, which is pretty good. Now, obviously something that looks as I described, often with the glow on, incidentally, not around the witness, but around the object, things that look like that. But I know of nobody on the planet that could build things that look like that and fly like that. The ability to go straight up and down, make right-angle turns at speeds like a few thousand miles an hour, land in a space not much bigger than themselves and take off from that space, go several thousand miles an hour as observed on radar, typically without much noise, without any visible external engines, without any wings, without any tail. If they could have been here, they would have been made here, and we'd have used them in a whole bunch of wars. We're a planet that does have wars occasionally, rather often, isn't it? Judging by our military budget, which is greater than the sum of the next 5 countries' budget, which scares the heck out of me living in Canada. We don't spend that kind of money, thanks to the military. Nobody wants to attack Canada. The good guys. Okay. Now, this is the largest, well, I should ask put in one more piece of information. The guys who did this study asked an obvious question, which I'm sure has occurred to most of you. Is there really any difference between these unknowns and the knowns? Maybe we missed the boat on the screening process. Let's do a chi-square statistical analysis. If you're not a mathematician, don't worry. You look at 6 different observables, apparent size, color, shape, speed. And there's another one in there. Knowns match the knowns. If so, then you can say, well, it's very likely the unknowns are just misknowns. Study that the probability that the unknowns are just misknowns is less than 1%. Less than 1%. Now, that doesn't prove that they're alien spacecraft. It says the probability that they're just misknowns is less than 1%, which is pretty darn small. Now, this is the oldest, the largest, one of the ones we've been to the most about studies of flying saucers, and if you look at the noisy negativist book, any of them, you won't find any of it. How many people here copy of Project Blue Book's Report 14? Just raise your hand. 1. Okay, you heard me speak about it before. This is what it looks like. They're available. They're listed on the sheet back there. I've talked to crowds all over the country, and typically fewer than 2% have read any of these 5 large-scale scientific studies I'm going to talk about. So don't feel bad about it. It's okay. But now you know. There is data. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Symposium on Unidentified Flying Objects. This was hearings before the Committee in Science and Astronautics, House of Representatives, Congress that is, July 29, 1968, 7:05 a.m. in Elizabeth, New Jersey, for those of you who are interested in astrological stuff. 6 scientists testified in person, 6 more in writing only. I was one of the latter group of 6, and the only one of the 12 without a deeper degree. Everybody knows what BS is. MS is just more of the same, and Pete just explained it. Anyway, scientists covering professional backgrounds: astronomy, astrophysics, psychology, biology, civil engineering, nuclear physics, atmospheric physics. People from respectable institutions: Cornell, Berkeley, Stanford, Westinghouse, General Dynamics. Best paper by far the late Dr. James E. McDonald, for physics in the Institute of Atmospheric Physics, and most UFOs are seen in the atmosphere at the University of Arizona. Jim was originally a skeptic, as I was too. He was challenged. He visited Project Blue Book. There's loads of good reports that had been ignored. Talked to over 500 witnesses, and in his paper, and it's listed on book list back there, I have it available as a separate publication, 71 pages long. He deals with 41 separate cases, subdivided into 6 groups, each group dealing with the objection of the noisy negativist. You know, how come they're never seen on radar? It gives you half a dozen good radar cases. How come they're never seen over big city? It gives you a bunch of big city cases. Well, why aren't they ever seen by multiple witnesses, and where the one witness is just a defined kook as anybody who claims to have seen a UFO, of course. He gives you a bunch of multiple witness cases. How come they're never seen by the professionals of the sky, you know, the pilots, the astronomers, the meteorologists? You get a bunch of sightings by each of those groups. So you can raise any of those objections you wish. But please don't reach a conclusion until you've studied his cases, because none of those objections, or any others I've been able to find, stand up under careful scrutiny. Outstanding piece of work. For those who say there are no good cases because they've only been reading the noisy negativist literature, usually done from people from their armchairs, his paper is well worth looking at. How many people here have read the congressional hearings document? Oh, I'm not in a hotbed of ufology, I guess. I never am. Let's look at the next slide. UFO evidence was put out in 1964 in a new edition, which you'll see in a minute, 30 years later. This was put out by NICAP, which used to had as many as 14,000 members at one time, National Engagement Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Major Donald Kehoe wrote several interesting books. They have 146 unknowns sorted out from about 45 cases, separate chapters on sightings by commercial pilots, by police officers, by engineers, scientists, astronomers, and an excellent chapter on evidence for intelligent control of some UFO. Ever heard of it? How many people here have read the UFO evidence? A lot of learning to do, that's what it's all about. Let's look at the next one. That's the 30 years later edition, greatly expanded. Same guy, Richard Hall, who was active with NICAP. To say there isn't any data, well, except for that stuff I'm not going to look at, is really what they're saying. Don't bother me with the, well, I'll give you the 4 basic rules for, and this is to anything, not just, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. Easier, and nobody will know the difference. And do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much darn trouble. And you can get away with proclamation most of the time. And that works on anything. You want to debunk something, those are the rules, and follow them. I hope you don't, but let's look at the next one. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was chairman of the astronomy department at Northwestern University for many years. He was the Air Force Project Blue Book scientific consultant of UFOs for over 20 years. Most famous for its explanation up in Michigan in the 60s. And he collected more than 100 cartoons, because that one didn't go over well with the... He said some sightings might have been caused by swamp gas, and it got turned into UFOs or swamp gas. A sense of humor. He published after his work with Project Blue Book was over and Blue Book was canceled, that he does not believe that UFOs can be identified as swamp gas or any other, swept under any other rug. He gives information that couldn't be explained, a number of reports by scientists, etc. Has some recommendations about what we can do to get more information, and some strong comments about the inadequacy of the University of Colorado study, the next slide. Referred to as the Condon report, Dr. Edward U. Condon, world-famous physicist at the University of Colorado. Titled, it isn't scientific and it's mostly about IFOs, not UFOs, but it is long, 965 pages. And he spent $140,000 on this study, our money incidentally. And if you read the headlines in January 1969, scientific study shows no UFOs. Study of UFOs, no benefit to science. Nonsense, some newspapers said. One of them said, now the UFO nuts can join the Flat Earth Society and let us, the rest of us do something useful. Now all of that garbage, and that's what it was based on and Condon's summary and conclusions. Of course, the people didn't read the report, which of course I did. If you look, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, of space scientists, had a UFO subcommittee. No UFO nuts. I'm a member of the AIA. They wouldn't let me on the committee because I'd reached a conclusion that some were exo spacecraft. You know, after 11-year study, you'd think anybody would reach a conclusion. And I was the worst bias by far, but anyway. They quietly studied and a lot of other stuff, and they published their findings in the scientific journal, Aeronautics and Astronautics. Didn't make headlines. They found that one could come to the opposite conclusions from Dr. Condon on the basis of the data in the report, that any phenomena with 30% known is certainly worthy of further investigation. 30% of 117 cases studied in detail could not be identified. And there's a whole big chapter on government involvement in UFO investigations, and not one single Project Blue Book Special Report 14, even though it covered 20 times as many cases. And did Condon know about it? I know he did, because I wrote him about it and got an answer acknowledging my letter. Don't, what the public doesn't know, don't tell them. Don't bother to tell. In other words, you can make a darn good case for some UFOs as alien spacecraft just by looking at the data in the Condon report. When garbage is there for padding, I think. How many people here have read Dr. Condon's book? How many have read Dr. Hick's, the previous one? It's usually 2-to-1, Hynek over Condon, book. But, and it's funny, I get astronomers telling me, oh, there's no data, no good compelling evidence. They never talk about his book on the subject, the guy who was the consultant for 20 years, more than 20 years. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. Okay, now, an obvious question. So how come the big shots of scientism haven't jumped on the pro-UFO bandwagon as they so obviously have not? The reasons. First is ignorance. As many as 2,000 people, 1,000 engineers and scientists at once. I never get more than 50% have read any of these documents. And the noisiest negativism invariably comes from the people in the subject. I happen to believe if you're going to express a professional opinion, it should be based on a study of the evidence, knowledge, and ethics. Something lacking in the noisy negativist pronouncements from on high. Now, if you want to preface your comment with, I don't know anything about the subject, but my personal opinion is ABC, that's fine. The professional opinions and everything else demand knowledge and ethics. Really lacking in this case. Scratch a skeptic, you find somebody who's putting down what he is on. Second problem, the laughter curtain, the fear of ridicule. I check all my audiences. 10% have seen a UFO, they believe. How many reported it? Only 10% of the 10%. Biggest reason given for not reporting, they think I was some kind of a nut. There have only been a dozen PhD theses done. Takes guts to sponsor one, doesn't it? There's more to the subject than the laughter curtain. And matter of fact, I did an interesting experiment on a college campus in a class. I said, I want to find out what you think about this subject and what you think other people. I want you to vote with your eyes. Vote with your hands, and your instructor and I will count the votes. 8% of that class, of about 100 students, thought that most people didn't believe in UFOs. 80% of that group did believe in UFOs. But your behavior, will you report a sighting, will you sponsor a PhD thesis, etc.? Will you cover it fairly in a newspaper? That's based on your perception of how other people will respond. And that, unfortunately, is not very the perception is. I've only had 11 hecklers and over 700 lectures. That ought to tell you something, because as you can see, I'm not an apologist. Not a closet apologist. I try to tell it like it is. You'll get that many. 700 lectures, 11 hectares, 2 of them are drunk. If you're talking about sports, religion, politics, etc. Okay. Well, okay, here's a good place to show that. Wait until you're instructor. Some Gallup poll. Way back, 40 years ago, only 46% said UFOs were real. And the newspapers played that as 4% said they weren't. But that wasn't true. Only 29% said they weren't. Said, I don't know. Now, as we went to the moon, the percentage who said they were real went up from to 54 to 30. That's 1.8 times as many believers as non-believers. By 1978, it was better than 2 to 1, 57 to 27. Now, the noisy negativists were very successful. By 1987, it was only 1.6 to 1, believers over non-believers. Well, the skeptics have an explanation for that. It's all that tabloid stuff. Tabloid papers, tabloid television shows. There used to be a number of them on the year. Well, that's a testable hypothesis. Here's the data for, I use 78 because they broke down the education of the respondents into 3 groups rather than 2. These are adults with a grade education, a high school education, or a college background. Now, with only a full education, indeed, the non-believers slightly the believers. But getting a high school diploma made the ratio of good guys to better than 2 to 1. The shocker is that with a college background, it was almost 3 to 1, 66 to 22. Notice the percentage who didn't have an opinion decreased as you get. So the greater the education, the more likely to believe in flying saucers. You're not at the bottom of the barrel, you're with the cream of the crop. Time to come out of the closet. It's one of the ways that the truth is suppressed with all good intentions by what I call the ancient academics and fossilized physicists, you see. Give the impression that believes in that crazy stuff, so people don't get involved. They don't report. Now, don't check. I haven't hit the third reason why the big shots haven't jumped on the bandwagon. Ego. Your psychiatrist. Boy, do they play amateur ufologists. There's a Harvard professor, psychiatrist. He came up with a Freudian action for UFOs. The round disc shape, an obvious symbol for the female breast. The honest to God. And the large cigar shape, obviously a phallic symbol. He provided not even one case to substantiate this garbage. That explanation got widely distributed. And another Harvard professor had a little ego. If aliens were visiting Earth, they would certainly wish to talk to the National Academy of Sciences, of which both he and Dr. Condon were members. They haven't asked for an appointment, they must not be coming here. What are we going to learn from the National Academy? How little we know about them there compared to them. Ego's an important thing. Now finally, the fourth reason is a general willingness to say it's impossible, when what is really meant is, I don't know how, as an ego kicker there too, of course. If that were possible, I would know about it because I'm a smart guy. I mean, that's the attitude. And there's a whole bunch of these impossibles. They've gone by the wayside over the last 60 years, most of them. There were people who said you couldn't go to the moon, you couldn't fly in a rocket. It's a long, sad story. And more damage has been done to progress by the impossibilites. I gotta write a book sometime. It's impossible, isn't it? And list all the cases which we know were not true, that were listed as impossible, that we've already accomplished. And then look at in what we say is impossible. The loudest area of the impossibilites is, you can't get here from there. And the astronomers say, look, it's a huge universe, probably life all out there, and some of them are probably sending those our way, so we ought to listen with huge radio telescopes, but you can't get here from there. Which is utter nonsense. No, you can't on a bicycle. I mean, that's true. But try to get from New York to Los Angeles on a bicycle one day. You can do it, but it would take a little longer. Now, can you get here from there or not? Well, I worked on nuclear fission rockets and nuclear fusion rockets. And, well, I might as well show you one. Next slide. I'll show you this one. There's a whole family of nuclear rocket engines. There's a nozzle here. They use liquid hydrogen. Comes in cold, goes out hot. That's the simplest way to describe it. There's a fission reactor in here. I worked for Westinghouse on this, had some experiments running in there. It's this big, only 1,100 megawatts. That's half the power of Grand Coulee Dam. Los Alamos' biggest was a little larger, 7 feet in diameter, 4,400 megawatts. Twice the power of Grand Coulee Dam. This is back in the 60s, incidentally. You paid for this. I mean, maybe you didn't know about it, but you paid for it. Nuclear fission. The Navy, there are over 400 nuclear-powered ships of one kind or another around the world. You can actually go around the world underwater in a nuclear-powered submarine. And the aircraft carriers don't need refueling for a minimum of 10 years, some as long as 18 years. That's pretty potent stuff. What I'm really excited about are fusion reactions. Now, you may not realize it, but nuclear fusion is the most important source of energy in all of our lives. You know the sun up there, you do see it once in a while, I think. The sun is a fusion factory. It's not a mass of burning gas. There are no Arabs up there, no Standard Oil. When I worked on fusion rockets in the early 60s, the other way, you're blocking the screen is what he's trying to say, I think, right? I worked on nuclear fusion in 1962. If you pick the right reaction in the right way and kick particles out the back end of a fusion rocket that have 10 million times as much energy per particle as you can get in the dumb old chemical rocket. Friedman's law. I make them up as I go along. Technological progress comes from doing things differently in a full way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. You have to change how you do things. This laser is not just a better light bulb. That rocket is not just a better chemical rocket. In both cases, you got entirely involved. If there are civilizations out there that got started a little bit before we did, we would expect they know some things that we don't know. The point is that there are stars within less than 50 light years that are 1 billion years older than the sun. Billion years. I expect they know some things that we don't know. We'll talk about a particular one a little bit. Okay, the next slide. We put the nuclear rocket in operation out at the nuclear test site. Area 51 is just over the hills, incidentally. The rocket, liquid hydrogen going out. The facility cost, I don't know how many $1 million. That's a tank of liquid. Of course, the noisy negative has said, you could never run a rocket on liquid hydrogen, much dangerous. Just as there were many cities in the United States that had laws about the storage of gasoline for cars a little over 100 years ago because it was much too dangerous. Of course it's dangerous, but it's a question of how dangerous is it? Is it much worse than having... Of course, it'll get worse. It's, okay. Now, we've been talking about facts and data and solid information. Let's look at the next slide. That's really the question, isn't it? Never mind the saucer. You see the guys who cry. Is a nuclear fissile even little green men? Well, they're not little. They usually are little. Whether they're men or women or both or neither, I don't know. But this is overwhelming that responsible, respectable Earthlings, people you'd like testifying on your side in a court of law, have indeed on many, not only craft, but little guys or gals with the craft. Now we'll work our way up. It takes a little getting used to. Needed that. Out of practice, I guess. But there's a man named Ted Phillips in Missouri who over the past 40 years collecting physical traces is where one sees a saucer on or near the ground. And after it leaves, one finds the equivalent of burn rings, landing gear marks, little footprints. These are not crop circles. I don't know where they fit in this picture. That's another mystery. They're physical trace cases. Now, Ted himself has collected over 5,000 such reports. He's visited over 500 such cases. And in 16% of these cases, 1/6, they involve reports of little guys. Now, let's look at the next slide and see a typical. The traces here. This is Delphos, Kansas, the mid-70s. Ronnie Johnson, age 16, was finishing his chores for the evening. Looks brightly glowing, mushroom-shaped object, a foot or two up, 10 feet in diameter roughly. Really bright. It's so bright he's temporarily blinded. He's standing there gawking at this thing, his dog is with him, and you're paralyzed, can't move. Finally, the thing takes off. No noise. He dashes back to 75 feet to the house. Shouts to his parents, he's just seen flying saucer. They laugh at him, he gets mad. You don't need to believe me, go outside and see it yourself. It wasn't moving that quick. They go out and they do see it, then he takes it to where it had been on their farm. They get back now, and this ring is glowing, the bottom of the tree is glowing, this board is glowing. This is really weird. So his mother reaches down, touches the glowing ring of soil, her food's going down. Can't take pulses at the rest home where she works part-time as a nurse for the next few weeks. They call the sheriff's department, concerned about this. Enlow, I think, comes out, checks the soil for radiation. That's what everybody worries about for some strange reason. It wasn't radioactive. Article appears in the local paper, the Delphos Republican. Delphos at that time had 499 people. I don't know what its population is now. Anyway, somebody sends a copy of the clipping to Ted Phillip in the neighboring state of Missouri. This is Kansas. He calls the sheriff, who tells him he's known the Johnson family for years, all upright. You know, small town, everybody knows everybody. You can't get by with being too much of a bad sort, so to speak. So Ted goes out there and gets all of the soil down 14 in the ring and outside the ring. The soil is dried out. He runs tests. Look at the next slide. You'll see the results of one of his tests. Ring soil won't support seed germination. Normal soil does just fine from just 2 feet away. He runs moisture absorption tests. You see in the next slide. The ring soil won't absorb moisture. That's not glue. It's not plastic. It's normal water on the ring. Normal soil made instant mud. Let's look at this slide. Ring soil on the left, normal soil from just a few feet away on the right. Now please don't complain about that sophisticated soil retention device. I had one guy who said, I can't believe anything you said because of that stupid paper plate. I had to point out that at the University Nobel Prize-winning physics experiment when I was there, where they used an empty coffee can to hold up a vital piece of equipment. If I can use an empty coffee can, I can use a darn old paper plate. And there's a higher percentage of soluble minerals in the normal than out here. No, the ring soil is too salty to grow anything. Now that farm to irradiate with a huge microwave device which will penetrate to 14 inches of dirt to change the soil. So people will say there's no physical, as long as we ignore all those cases in which physical evidence was observed. Standard practice. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. Let's look at the next slide. Betty and Barney Hill, strange creature, I forget the name of the dog. Famous abduction case. Came back to 1961. The book came out in 1966, by John G. Fuller. That caused quite a stir at the time. There were 2 articles in Look magazine. There was a television movie in 1973. I was an advisor recommended to Universal Studios by these people. Now, don't ask me to explain that. But anyway, famous story. Betty and Barney were driving home from New Hampshire. They'd been up to Canada, quick vacation, and came down from Montreal. While they were in New Hampshire, September 19th, 1961, Betty spotted a strange object. Barney was driving. Betty watched it for a while. Her sister had seen something strange, and when it had been brought up to Barney, he had left, so Betty was a little cautious about saying anything. And finally she said, Barney, a flying saucer. Oh, come on, Betty, there aren't any flying saucers. Well, look. Oh, probably a Piper. Don't worry about it, Betty. Well, it can't be. Look how it's moving, Barney. Look at the lighting. Must be a helicopter, Betty. They fly in strange ways. What are you talking about this? They're driving south. Suddenly this thing went in parallel to them. Flies out in front of the vehicle, stops there. Barney jams on the brakes. There's nobody around. This is late at night. Tourist season's kind of over and before the leaves are great. Jumps out of the car with the binoculars that Betty had been using to watch this thing, mind you. And she's yelling at him, Barney, come back. He's determined he's going to prove to Betty that there's nothing strange about that strange sound there. Looks like about 60 feet in diameter, less than 600 feet away, making no noise. There's some red lights, but they're not blinking, and there's not red and green lights. And he's cranking up the binoculars. There's a double row of windows. Uh-oh, behind the windows, he sees some strange beings. Scares the hell out of him. Turns back, and meanwhile, Betty is shrieking at him. Barney, come back. And they're out in the middle of nowhere, and he's going to this stupid flying saucer. And Barney comes back, and there's some beeping sound, then another set of beeping sounds, and there's a sign that says Concord, New Hampshire, 17 miles. But they remembered it being 30-some miles. There's a missing time interval here. They drive on home. They get home 2 hours late, expected to get home. Barney's shoes, Betty's dress is all messed up. Wouldn't wear it again. Couldn't use the shoes except for gardening. He was a very sharp dresser. They call the local base at Portsmouth. There's a military base there. Report there's something about the beings Barney had seen behind the windows. I mean, this is 1961. They wouldn't say anything about the beings. And the Air Force seemed interested. And they develop a number of symptoms. Then he starts having nightmares about being kidnapped by strange beings. Barney develops ulcers so bad that he can't go for a period of time. Barney seeks medical treatment. The doctors, after a while, says, I've done all I can for you medically, Barney. I really think you ought to see a psychiatrist. Because there's something going on, and we don't know what it is. Ulcers relate to, besides now we know, being caused by pylori, whatever the bacteria is. Often there's a psychological problem that triggers the attack. I mean, things have gotten so bad that Barney can't go to work. And he finally winds up with a recommendation to Dr. Bernard Simon down in Boston, whose specialty was treating shell-shock war veterans. Now we'd say post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD. That sounds fancy. World War II, there are a lot of vets who had problems. Your buddy's head is blown off next to you. It's a little hard to infiltrate. And Dr. Simon, a psychiatrist, was using special medical hypnosis to get people to relive experience, to go back and all the feelings. And apparently, if you can do that, you can work it through and you can come out well. This is not parlor game hypnosis. Amnesia after each session. So they drove the 60 miles down to Boston every Saturday because they both were working. He was a supervisor in the welfare department, state of New Hampshire. Barney was on the governor's civil rights commission besides working for the post office. And Dr. Simon would hypnotize Barney with Betty outside, tape it, have him relive a portion of the experience, induce amnesia so he couldn't tell Betty about it, and then do the same thing with her. And this went on for many months. And then he thought they were ready. He brought them both in together and played back a composite tape, which I've heard, based on them, and they were astonished to find that they had each independently relived the same incredible experience of that crab landed, of them being taken on board against their will, being treated as specimens, stick a needle here, scrape some skin there, and then put back out until they wouldn't remember what happened. They didn't remember. And that's a quite spectacular experience when you think about it. Anyway, they hadn't intended to go public with this at all, but they talked to some group, and somebody told a reporter who talked to a number of people, and he wrote up the story in the Boston Traveler or Herald paper. Much to their shock, they sought legal advice. What can we do to stop this? And there wasn't anything they could do, and they went to Dr. Simon. Yeah, what's going on here? They both expected to lose their jobs. Well, they didn't. And a man named John, who's a fine writer, had covered another UFO story, incident at Exeter, wrote a book about that, Exeter, New Hampshire, that is. He talked to the Hills an agreement where as long as it was approved by Dr. Simon, and I've seen the notes, they're at the Boston University archives, and Dr. Simon wrote, rough herd on John Fuller. Couldn't say this, you can't say that, that's not true, I'll be laughed out of town. Anyway, it's a darn good book. It came out in, I don't know how many countries. And then the television program on NBC, UFO Incident. James Earl Jones played Barney. Estelle Parsons, Betty. It was quite a success. So the story's gotten all over the world. Now, you say, big deal, there's an interesting story. Do you believe them? I used to say, well, it's in my gray basket. I don't know. But then I had the lucky opportunity to meet them both. When I was working for Westinghouse, they were there to do a television program, and the people at the television station were doing some programs. They told me where they were staying. We had dinner together. And I was very impressed. They're obviously sensible, sensitive, intelligent people. This was in November '68. Barney died in February '69. So I can say I have talked to them both, but I've seen Betty at conferences. I've been in her home and interviewed her for my movie UFOs Are Real, which is on the list in the novel. So, to say the least, I buy their story. The most convincing thing to me is the star map that Betty saw on board the craft. She's reliving a portion of the experience, and she's telling Simon under hypnosis that she asked the leader where he was from. In the understatement of the decade, she says, "I know you're from around here." And he shows her what I can only describe as a three-dimensional star map. A bunch of points of light, supposedly stars, as he connected by line. Different kinds of lines. Trade routes, occasional expeditions, trade routes. That sounds pretty good. And so she asks him, "Well, where are you on the map?" Wise guy alien says, "You know where you are on the map?"
Yeah.
"No." "Well, how can I tell you where I'm from if you don't know where you're at?" End of discussion. She said, "I don't know anything about it." Now, poor Dr. Simon, listening to this stuff, he did so. He asked Betty if she could remember what the map looked like, and gave her a post-hypnotic suggestion. "Please draw it later on, if and only if you can remember it accurately." She did that and put it in, and it appears in the book, and you can see it in the next slide. The department uses a teaching. Each one of those beads, there's 246, I think, something like that, stands for a particular star in its proper three-dimensional location. What's difficult here back then, this was in the late 60s, early 70s, is we had great data on the angles where stars are. We know where to aim a telescope to see a particular star. But the astronomers aren't going anywhere. We had lousy distance data. You get 3, 4, or 5 star catalogs, and the same star out past 20 light years might have 3 or 4 different distances given. It doesn't matter if you're not going anywhere, except if you're trying to build a model, you better have the distances right. 3D. After an enormous amount of work, Marjorie thought she'd find many patterns that matched. She didn't find any. Then there's a new catalog of star distances that came out, the Wilhelm-Gleacy catalog. She rebuilt the big model, and there was the pattern. One and only one pattern that matched angle for angle, line length for line length, what Betty had drawn. It was a great moment for Marjorie, to say the least. I had been called in by the head of APRO to see if I could help Margie. That was Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, like NICAP, long gone. So I was in touch with her. I visited her in Ohio. I went with her when we made a presentation to Dr. Hynek in Chicago at the Hadley Planetarium of all places. Let's look at the next slide. This is the one that matches. Now, the sun is up here in case you're wondering. Several special things. One, all the pattern stars are the right kind for planets and life. And all the right kind for planets and life in this very well-defined three-dimensional volume of space are part of the pattern. You say, big deal. Well, as it happens, within, at that time, 55 light years of the sun, there were 1,000 stars that we knew of. Now the number's gone up because we can now see smaller stars, because our measuring techniques are better. But out of those 1,000 stars, 46 were similar to the sun. Not too hot, not too cold, not too old, not too new. Likely places for planets and life. About 5%, 46 out of 1,000. And yet, all the right kind for planets and life are part of the pattern connected by the lines, and all the ones connected by the lines are part of the right kind for planets and life. The chance of that being a coincidence, well, it depends on who you believe, from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in a million. It's not a coincidence, in other words. Now, nobody doing what Marjorie did back when the event took place could have come up with the right identification for the stars because we didn't have the right distance data back then. We have much better data now. The Europeans put up the Hipparcos satellite, which this is millions of all the pattern stars are in a plane. Like thin slice of pepperoni, as opposed to reason about the travel as happens. And of course, this work identifies the base stars. It should be a flare of trumpets. The base stars are Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli, which the normal response is, who cares? Never heard of those two stupid sounding stars. That's the constellation predicted on the net. You can't see them from here. You got to go below the equator to see them. Anything special about them? Well, as it happens, there is. Not known beforehand. It turns out that Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli just happen to be the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our entire local neighborhood. Now, the sun is out in the boonies. Nothing really close and nothing out behind us for quite a while. The nearest star to the sun is about 4.3 light years away. These two stars from each other are only an eighth of a light year apart. They're 35 times closer to each other than we are to the next star over. Now, one of the implications of that is if you're on a planet around one, looking over at the other, it's visible all day long. That's how bright it is. And you can directly observe planets. You don't need to guess with a reasonable sized telescope. Now, one other important fact. Those two stars are a cool billion years older than the sun. Some say 2, but I'm a very conservative guy, as you can tell. It's only 1 billion years older than the sun. Again, back to Friedman's law, technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. Surely somebody who got started on his or her technological kick a long time ago is going to know some things we don't know. Just look back 110 years. Before airplanes, before rockets, before radio, before microwave, before DNA, nuclear, all the other things that we take for granted today. Think about that for a minute. Computers. You know, the kids grow up thinking we always had computers. Always had television. Some of you are as old as I am probably and can remember when you didn't have television at home. And you didn't have a microwave. So, very exciting piece of work. I wrote the first article about it in the early 70s. I convinced the editor of Astronomy Magazine to do a piece on it. It got more response than anything they'd ever published before or since. And over the next year after that, they published 10 more articles, some pros, some con. All the con guys, that's a good word for them, ignored an accurate description of what Marjorie had done. And that includes Carl Sagan. He talked about it in the Cosmos program, which got seen by, 600 million people over the years. Blatant misrepresentation. I think it's an outstanding piece of work. Let's look at the next slide. This is the names of the stars, and that's the Gliese catalog. You might have to focus just a little bit on that. Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli. Those distances are light years. They've been slightly modified. We thought it was only 36.6 light years. It's 39 light years, 39.2. The pattern doesn't change. But very important thing here is often the noisy negativists will try to say, look how much energy it would take to get to another galaxy. Who cares? If my wife wants a loaf of bread for dinner, I don't say, I'll be back next week, honey. There's that great bakery down in Sydney, Australia. He says, Stan, the supermarket's a mile away. Go get a loaf of bread for dinner, will you? You see my point. Who cares about Andromeda Galaxy, 2.3 million light years away? So what? It is of no significance. The local neighborhood is the place to start. I get a little irked with some of these people who bring in these straw horses and beat them to death. And you can see we're out in the boonies. An important piece of work. Let's look at the next one. West Coast. This is my favorite. That's a pretty good sized headline. You don't see many like that these days. Army finds flying saucer. General believes it is radar weather gadget. Air Force says flatter picked up on range. And the article goes all the way down the rest of the front page, Dateline Roswell. Now, you have to understand something. Back then,